Tunisia is facing.
Yes.
Can you explain what are these security dangers? Who is creating this insecurity and what is the government doing about it?
Security is a very basic and fundamental issue, and there can be no political change in Tunisia without security and stability. There was a lot of chaos in the country, and people were not feeling safe. So far, we have achieved a lot of improvements on the security front. We're giving it a lot of attention.
Coming up in this news hour, the anti-government rallies continue in the Gulf Kingdom of Bahrain. This time, protesters target the US Embassy. And a major cabinet reshuffle in Oman after weeks of anti-government protests there. Stay with us if you can on Al Jazeera.
It's filled with surprises, yet with a touch of the familiar. It's all those things you imagined, and some you didn't. It intrigues and fascinates, and often delights. It's a story of the world, and it's one with many endings. The 5-star global network fly to over 90 destinations on board one of the world's youngest fleets. Qatar Airways, world's 5-star airline.
Afghanistan is faced with a huge challenge.
Relations have gone really sour between us and our allies.
We have inflicted considerable damage on the enemy.
The people who make international headlines.
Ultimately, the truth will out.
They want to stop this publication of information that embarrasses them.
Make time for Sir David Frost. Frost over the world. At this time on Al Jazeera.
David Foster with you here on this Al Jazeera News Hour and the very latest on the Libyan uprising. Rebel fighters in the Libyan town of Ras Lanuf are battling pro-Gaddafi forces as the unrest continues in the oil-rich North African nation. There are reports of airstrikes leaving several dead, including a family trying to flee the violence. Al Jazeera has learned that the British citizens released by the rebels on Sunday were captured after an exchange of gunfire. 8 British nationals, including a diplomat and members of the Special Air Service, were captured soon after they landed in eastern Libya. US President Obama says NATO is considering all of its options before deciding on a response to the crisis in Libya. He also said that military intervention is not off the table. Yeah, I suppose with that in mind, we're going to talk about one of the options that some US politicians have proposed. The United States sending arms to the rebels. And I suppose Nick Clark with us once again in Washington, D.C. There are quite a few ways of doing that.
Absolutely. A lot of focus on this, David, right now. As we reported earlier, some Republicans and Democrats have made that suggestion. And to discuss that further, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Larry Korb. He served as the Assistant U.S. Secretary of Defense from 1981 to 1985. That was under the former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, and he's now a senior fellow at the Center of American Progress. Welcome, Mr. Korb.
Nice to be with you.
Arming the rebels, a realistic option?
Well, you can arm the rebels, provided it doesn't look like it's being done exactly by Western powers. I think the last thing you want is this to be seen as Americans versus Muslims or Westerners versus Muslims. But if some Arab countries, some Muslim countries want to do it, I think that's different.
So you mean by proxy, effectively, and there has been some talk about Saudi doing it for the United States?
Well, it would, because again, you know, Saudi Arabia is an Arab country. Saudi Arabia is the home of the holiest of the Arab places, Mecca and Medina. And the fact, if they were doing it, that would be seen, I think, as much less anti-Western.
But on the other hand, doesn't it compromise the United States if that happens? I mean, Saudi Arabia is facing its own difficulties, and should things flare up there, if rulers respond with violence there, if Saudi's providing arms for the United States to Libya, then President Obama can't really condemn what's going on in Saudi, can he?
Well, again, I think there are two things. I mean, the reason that you would want to provide arms to the rebels now is basically to stop this horrible, almost like genocide. In other words, it's not that you're trying to overthrow a regime, you're trying to protect people who are being massacred for no good reason. I mean, when this is over, I think you're going to see a lot of the Libyan leaders brought before the International Criminal Court. So that's much different. I mean, in terms of Saudi Arabia, I mean, in terms of what the people want, I mean, that's not a violent revolution. The king, having come back, has, granted them, more benefits.
But it could flare up. That's the point.
Well, there's no doubt about it. But I think if it did, you would not see the Saudis acting the way Gaddafi has.
Okay. Let's stick to this. If this happens and the rebels have more arms and have more means of attacking Gaddafi's forces, the point is, can they put it to good effect? Because they don't seem terribly well trained. So therefore, they need training too, which would mean that they would need American boots on the ground, presumably, to help them learn how to use these weapons. At the moment, they're practically shooting themselves.
Well, again, I think what you're trying to do now is prevent them from being massacred. Okay, that I think you have to keep that's your goal, and hopefully, if you can then buy time, the sanctions that the international community has put against Gaddafi, tying up of the financial assets of the family all around the world, will begin to take hold. And there's no doubt about the fact that you've got a lot of balls in the air here that you're trying to balance. But the most immediate is to stop the massacre of people who are opposed to the regime.
All right, we'll see how it pans out. Larry Korb, appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Very much. Thank you. Okay, well, U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates has made a surprise visit to Afghanistan. While there, he said the United States has no interest in permanent military bases in the country. Gates' trip comes as the U.S. continues to plan withdrawal of its troops from Afghanistan starting in July. The Afghan President Hamid Karzai has said there is a timetable in place for his forces to take over security duties by 2014. But Gates says that deadline does not necessarily mean the end of U.S. support in Afghanistan.
With the permission of the Afghan government, the United States, I think, is open to the possibility of having some presence here in terms of training and assistance, perhaps making use of facilities made available to us by the Afghan government.
That's Robert Gates, and that's it from Washington. Back to Doha.
Imagine if you went out to vote and a year later you still hadn't got a government. It'd make you pretty cross, wouldn't it? Well, it did. Hundreds of Iraqis who are on the streets of Baghdad saying that they actually feel they made a mistake voting in the country's 2010 elections. They reckon the current members of parliament have done nothing to solve the country's problems. AlJazeera's Rauya Raghi has more.
Regretful. Iraqi activists marking 1 year since the country's parliamentary elections. The vote was supposed to usher the country's first ever inclusive government. Instead,